Okay, so first of all, what is your full name and the spelling?
Okay, my name is Kanta Naik, or Kanta, as I'm sometimes called here. Spelled Kanta, last name Naik.
And what are your parents' names?
So my mother was Lalita Naik, and my father's name was Gopalji Naik.
Okay. And how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have five
Okay.
siblings. We're 4 girls and 2 boys in our family.
And could you map out like youngest to oldest?
Sure, I have a sister who's the oldest,
Okay.
and then I have a brother and another sister.
Oh, and their names too?
Okay, so my older sister is Pushpa.
Okay.
My brother is Ramesh.
Okay.
After him comes my sister Kumud, and then me. And then I have 2 younger siblings, a sister Tara
Okay.
and a brother Jayesh.
Okay. And so when is your birthday?
It's December the 14th, 1951,
Okay. And where were you born?
in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe.
Okay. And how many years did you live in Zimbabwe?
I lived in Zimbabwe till I got married, which was about at the age of 24.
Okay. So who in your family first immigrated to Zimbabwe and where did they immigrate from?
My dad first emigrated, and he came from Gujarat.
Okay.
And worked for a gentleman who had come originally as one of those indentured laborers that came to work in the sugar cane plantations of South Africa around Durban. And as all most Indian people do, they become enterprising business people. And so he moved up, and by that time had gotten up to what was Southern Rhodesia then, and opened a store for spices from India for all the people who were working there.
Okay.
And then went back to India to get 2 strapping lads to come help him in the store, and my dad was one of them.
Okay.
So that's how come he emigrated to Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, about in the 1920s, I think early 1920s.
Wow. And then did your mom, was she already in Zimbabwe?
No, Dad went back after several years to get married, and so
Okay.
Mom was also from Gujarat, and then she came 5 years later when he was able to pay for her passage to come across on the ship.
Okay, that's so cool. And so what was your life like in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, so growing up in Zimbabwe was very interesting because we were an Indian community, and a
Right.
very small one at that, in a country that was the majority of the people were African,
Okay.
but it was ruled by a small minority of European people. We called the white people then, because Southern Rhodesia was a colony of Britain.
Okay.
And so I grew up in this place that had a fair bit of racial tension, though not as overt as South Africa. But we didn't feel it as kids. We grew up in a very lovely, close-knit Indian community with all our cultural celebrations, our Gujarati school in the afternoon. And so it wasn't until I was in the last year of high school that I actually realized what was happening around me, and that things were very different.
Right.
And that I wasn't aware of any sort of racism or anything until then, which is quite lovely not to be aware of that as a child. But
Yeah. So it
was
was like a
pretty different.
close-knit community.
very close, and we shared a lot, did lots together, knew all the families, attended everybody's weddings, the whole, but it was like being in a village in India, I suppose, but it was lovely. We were only about 150 total Indian families, maybe in the country,
Wow.
never mind the town
Okay.
where I lived, so.
And were you guys ever targeted or discriminated?
Not until, discriminated for sure. We were not allowed to work in any public places. So the only 3 options I had for career was I could be, I was part of, so there were the European people, which was a white population, there was the black population, and then in between we had Indian,
Okay.
and this was all people from India. There weren't many people from other Asian countries then.
Okay.
And then and colored people who were the mix of black and white. So the Asian and coloreds formed their own little group. We were a small group. And yes, very much discriminated against, not as severely as maybe the blacks were discriminated against, but there were very clear divisions in everything. Like the school system was 3-tiered. There was African education, Asian and colored education, European education, and nobody could cross over into the other, with a large part of the funding going to the European sector, like almost 80% of the total funding, yet the population was largely in the black schools, and we had a few Asian and colored schools. So all that to say that I had the choice of 3 careers. I could work as a teacher in an Asian and colored school. a nurse in an Asian and colored hospital,
Wow.
or perhaps a secretary for an Asian and colored business person or shop owner. So, since I couldn't type to save my soul very well, or don't like the sight of blood, I guess I became a teacher, and that's what I did.
Wow.
So yeah, we had lots of limitations. We weren't allowed to
Right.
participate in the public sector as such. It was totally controlled by the European people.
So what was your education like then?
So because it was British, you know, we studied like a person in primary school in England would have studied. So the
Okay.
medium was English. All the books came from there. Read about little, you know, Janet and John and living in this big red barn and autumn leaves that we had no context for anything. But we grew up very much on the British system.
Okay, and what were the differences then between the three streams? Like they were separated?
So, you know, it was, it of course delineates how much you can do afterwards. So,
Right.
you know, the black population, of course, had less access than even we did. Again, they could work within the black sector, so there were schools, lots of schools and hospitals and so on, so people did manage to do that. But you were very much kept at a certain level, right? And so you didn't participate in civic events. And as a matter of fact, I had a really interesting experience when I was in grade 12, because I was the head girl of our very large high school, of which there were only two in the country. And there was a young man called John Marsh who was the head boy at the same time as me. And that year, the Bulawayo Julian Council had decided to, they had a great idea of creating a Bulawayo Junior Council. So they were going to take 2 students from each of the high schools and have them participate like a junior council. So they were going to have every one of us have a civic role, and then we could choose a junior mayor and mayoress, and it was all very, very wonderful idea. And so John and I were asked to be part of that team. But they hadn't realized at the time that that would create a complication, because John and I were not allowed to use the facilities in City Hall. So they relocated us. We still were in part of the junior council, but we were relocated to another place out of the city. So we couldn't sit in the chambers and all of that because of John and I. And so that was one of my first ahas about.
It was all because of your race.
Oh yeah, yeah. That suddenly it was good to have all these students do this, but you know.
Right.
And the same, I played netball for school teams, but we always played on our school grounds.
Right.
Because if we played it in their school grounds, we couldn't use the washroom facilities. So things like that, and you don't know, recognize as a child so much, but as I got older, it all sort of came together like, oh, I see.
Yeah.
This is different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
so we did grow up in that sort of an environment, although we certainly had a very good education. We had, we did well. My sisters went to university. I went to teachers' college. We had, we had access within our group to those things, so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. And so your teacher's college, what certification did you get with that?
So it was affiliated to then the University of Rhodesia, which was in Harare, and the program came from Birmingham in England.
Oh, okay.
So we're very much trained under the teacher training program like a person in Britain would have had at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
So it was a 3-year teacher training program.
Okay. And then did you work as a teacher?
I worked as a teacher because you couldn't actually get into teachers' college unless you were given a government grant. And you had to apply for it, and if you did get it, then you were funded for your schooling, but you had to teach for the government at a salary for 3 years after
Like
you
a return of
graduated. That was
service.
and so I did that, but I moved to Zambia because I was getting married, so
Okay.
I left then to move to Zambia,
Oh,
where I lived and taught for about 16 years before we emigrated to Canada.
Okay. And how did you meet your husband then in Zambia?
Through mutual friends.
Okay.
His brother was married to a girl from Zimbabwe, and we were family friends. So
Okay.
met him when he came there.
That's awesome. And then were your children born in Zambia?
Yes, both my children were born in Zambia, and they were 10 and 14 when we immigrated here.
Okay. And what year did you immigrate to Canada?
1992.
Okay.
So
And what was like the decision process behind that?
So Zambia at the time was an independent country. It was granted, it was also part of what was called the Federation, which was then, we were Southern Rhodesia where I was born. This country was Northern Rhodesia.
Okay.
And Nyasaland was a third country, which is present-day Malawi. Those 3 countries were under the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland that the British government controlled. But Zambia was granted its independence in 1964.
Okay.
So it was an independent country, and so we moved there. But things were economically really difficult in Zambia because, you know, at the time of independence, now remember I told you, as it was in southern Rhodesia, the Asian and colored or black people were not allowed to participate in civic affairs.
Right, yeah.
So then the country was granted independence, but people didn't have the experience to work in government and so on. So, you know, inevitably a system like that isn't going to succeed very well, in my opinion anyway. And so things became really tough in Zambia, both economically and unlike Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, which was quite, had an infrastructure that had, you know, a wider exposure to being able to bring revenue. Zambia relied only on copper.
Okay.
And when the copper prices around the world dropped, it became a big problem for the country. So it really, the local currency devalued. And, you know, the university that was there in Zambia, their degrees were not recognized outside of Zambia. So as our kids grew up, we found ourselves in a quandary about them and what we were going to do, because we didn't really have the education opportunities we want for our kids. You know, health, there was no security with health care. The hospitals were overrun, you know, resources were not available.
Right.
As well as our own physical security, you know, was compromised, because in a country where there's lots of economic woes, you know, then crime is rampant because people have to survive. So we were living with thick burglar bars on our doors and windows and gates and so on. And pretty soon we felt like, you know, what are we going to give our kids? And so we needed to look out for a better future for them. You know, to me, the three most important things are your health, your safety, you know, and your education. So none of those were sort of opportunities we felt would, you know, give our kids a leg up in the world and that. And some other actions precipitated a quick move then to leave, because my husband, very unusually in Zambia, when the price of their local staple, the mealie meal, which is the cornmeal that most people eat with some vegetable or some meat relish, if they can afford that, the price had been escalating so much, and Zambian people are pretty patient, very good-natured and hard-working, and this was just too much for them to bear. So there were very serious food riots. And I was studying away in Spain at the time, thinking if we had to leave the country that I should get a qualification that might be internationally recognized. And so my husband was looking after the children, but he got caught up in the riots, and his car was stoned, and he was unable to go home to the children and, you know, our parents. And so he had to stay in town for a night or two. And I think that was when he made the decision that we needed to leave, because he said, you know, the day that I can't go home to my children, I got to be thinking about, you know, what's happening here. So that really precipitated our move. And luckily for us, he had a brother here in Canada who assisted us. So that was the reason to come.
How did your husband end up in Zambia then?
Because they were born there. Like much the same as we were born in Zimbabwe, his parents had come to Zambia, and they were born there.
And then how did his brother decide to move to Canada?
Again, because things were getting tough in Zimbabwe, and he could see that. And he was in business and a very successful businessman, so he had some resources with which to leave and come to Canada as an investor. And so that's how he was able to make his way out of Zambia, and left for the same reasons that eventually we left for.
And did he sponsor you guys?
Yeah, he did. And at that time, you could sponsor your siblings and that. So we came under that, and we still had to go through the process and so on, which took about 18 months.
Wow. And then when you came to Canada, where did you first land?
So we stayed for about 3 weeks with his brother, and then we moved to Port Coquitlam, where we had a small...
Was that in Vancouver?
Yeah, he was in Coquitlam here.
Coquitlam,
yeah,
okay.
And then we moved to Port Coquitlam, where we had a little tiny apartment, waiting to see where a job might take us and so on. And eventually, you know, I got a job with the school district in Abbotsford, so we ended up coming to live here.
Okay. And were your credentials recognized?
No. So initially, so I had a 3-year teacher training degree certificate in Zimbabwe. Then I did a master's degree in second language learning with a university from the States. But as you know, when you come to Canada, you have to have your credentials, you know, go through, like if you're a teacher, through the BC College of Teachers, so that you could get certified to teach in BC. At which time they look back at your undergrad and check what your courses were and so on. And as you know, back in Africa, things don't relate to here.
Right.
So according to the College of Teachers here, there were some gaps in my training, which wouldn't allow them to give me recognition for my master's, which I really, had with an American university. They said your undergrad isn't quite what it should have been, so you have to take, a couple more courses and get yourself up to speed. And so I did. Worked hard to get up, to satisfy the requirements that were sort of needed here. But I was already working. And then I could do that while, I had the job, because most of my certification, I believe, because I started to work. Now I'm wondering the dates are a bit hazy. But I guess I wouldn't have been able to work if that hadn't come through. So it probably was... No, because I was starting to sub. So I guess they recognized while things were in process, so it didn't take so long or something, because I was able to work soon after we came.
So did you leave Africa to go to the U.S. to study, or how
No,
did that
actually,
work?
there was a university in the States that was doing some satellite courses in Spain for sub-Saharan African teachers, because the U.S. Has embassies everywhere. Their embassy personnel take their children, or there's corporations that are working whose children go and live in these places, and the American government wanted to ensure that they had a quality education. So, and many of these countries with declining, devaluing currencies and so on couldn't necessarily offer perhaps what they might want for their students in order to attract enough people to go there. So they had paired up with some universities to offer some financial assistance, I guess, to teachers of international schools in sub-Saharan Africa, because that's where those kids were attending to get training and upgrading. So I was pretty lucky. I went through that process to study. So it took 3 summers and lots of work at home and online, and
all in Spain.
All for it would be 6 weeks a year in Spain, and the rest of it back where I was.
And then, so back in Canada, what was your husband doing while you were working?
So my husband was had left. His story is very different. I was lucky enough to land back into the profession that I had and so on. But he worked, and in Zambia you could climb up that corporate ladder very fast with just either being, I guess being in a non. Being a resident of Zambia, whereas some of the foreign companies that came would bring people who'd come there on 2-year, 4-year contracts, and they wanted more steady people that were local, but they didn't have to pay as much as they paid the expatriate people. And so he had a really good job there, but in our family story, he had to leave school at 15 to help his family. And so he didn't get a formal education or much later, and so that really was prohibitive, it was a limitation for him when we came here, and it was a struggle in the beginning to find things, and he just found several jobs over the course of his lifetime and he never really settled as well, I think, as I did, partly because he never regained his foothold, but he was sure that it was the right thing we did for our kids, and was quite happy to make the sacrifice for giving them a better future. So.
And what was his name?
His name is Ashok.
Ashok. Okay. And I'm not sure if I got do you know the exact day you came to Canada?
Yeah, August 6th, 1992.
Okay.
It was a big day for us.
Yeah, what were your thoughts like when you first entered Canada?
My goodness, so we were very excited because, it was a new beginning. It sounded like everything was going to be just so much better than we had it, and it was going to be a safer place. And I must say, what struck me when I first came was the beauty, the physical beauty of this place, and the cleanliness. Everything just seems so clean, because back home it's so dusty. Even the pavements are not paved, sort of thing. Often enough, it's shops that you walk in with, stepping out of the sand and into, so things are dusty and a little different. And so I was like stunned by the malls, and they what I thought was just the cleanliness of the place, and people were pretty friendly, and that everything functions systematically and
Yeah.
efficiently. And let's just say that was, a bit of a change.
For sure.
Yeah.
And what about any difficulties? Did you?
Yeah, it's just surprising that, we thought that having come to Canada as an immigrant with several assets that maybe many immigrants don't have. That is, a language and some training in English.
Right.
Relatives here would help you. Some money, ability to find a job, navigate the system. Kids not so little. We had so many things that I felt were like in place, and yet it was a very strange place.
Yeah.
And there was culture shock, despite me having worked at the American Embassy School, taught Canadian kids in the Canadian curriculum, and felt like I had, I wouldn't be that culture shocked, if you will. But it was the little things that people don't think about that really became big issues for us. For example, driving on the freeway.
Okay.
We drove on streets that were pretty much two-laned,
Oh.
and the speed limit was a lot less than it was here. So to have traffic in many lanes and across
Right.
bridges and exits and that was really quite terrifying in the beginning.
For sure.
We were afraid to take the wrong exit and not know where to come back, and yet, you could read a map. So when you look back on it now, you go like, what was I thinking, But
Yeah.
that was very daunting, as was going into the supermarkets and seeing the absolute range of things. And the first time we went to a supermarket, and it was called Overweighty then, I think the previous name for Save on Food.
Yeah.
And it was in Port Coquitlam, and we went in, and both of us were not able to decide what to buy. And we went back home, and then we went again with my sister-in-law a few days later, because like the number of brands of cereal and it was just overwhelming.
Okay.
And so we're like, okay, we have a lot to learn over here. So those are the things that actually were more, of an issue than one would think about the things that might be more of a problem, like, will I get a job, and will our kids like it, and will we,
Yeah. And did your kids like it?
Yeah, for them it's a novelty. They were young, it was new, and they miss their friends, they miss back home, but they've never even now really looked back on that as pining for back in Africa, the way we've remembered back home. I guess when they were that young, they were just adjusting to who they were themselves and trying to put it into a new place quite seamlessly, actually.
And so, did you work as a teacher in Abbotsford then? What was that like?
So I started as a teacher at Bakerview Elementary here in Abbotsford, and I was pretty fortunate to get that job. I think it was a time when there were several layoffs, but the reason that I did get the job was because I had the ESL.
Oh, okay.
And a couple of ESL teachers had just happened to be leaving at an inopportune time or something, and I got into a school then, and then enjoyed. Of course, I loved teaching and enjoyed the work, and it moved into a full-time position. And then I went into administration as a vice principal and then a principal.
At which school?
I was a vice principal at Alexander Elementary, Harry Sayers. And then I was a principal at Philip Sheffield Elementary just before it was closing. And then I moved to the board office, and I went in as district principal of special education or learning support services. It wasn't a job for me, I quickly realized, because my training is English as a second language, so lucky I was able to come back to that. So I was district principal of ESL, and then in my final years, I was the acting director of curriculum before I retired.
So you stayed in Abbotsford all that time. Okay. And did you ever experience any racism or discrimination?
I must say, not in my line of work or in the school district. I felt very much at par with any of my colleagues. I felt very valued. I was respected. I had nothing but just a wonderful experience working for the Abbotsford School District, and they are just a really lovely group of people working in our schools that care about kids and are open to diversity. And right now, Superintendent Kevin Garden, who has been superintendent for several years now, his leadership in this area, I think, is just has been wonderful. So, I've had just a wonderful experience with the school district, and I really felt treated extremely fairly, and I'm so proud to work for them and, continue to support them in any way I can because I just really value them as an organization and what they do.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I guess what about your extended family? Do they still live in Africa?
Yeah,
or?
so, I have a sister and two brothers still in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe.
Okay.
And at the moment things are very, very difficult there.
Oh, in what ways?
The country has just really struggled economically. There was an autocratic ruler there for years and years and years that was eventually deposed through what they are calling not a coup. And there was hope for a better turnaround of events, but I think things have actually spiraled quite downward. And I was just talking to my sister-in-law yesterday who said that they are experiencing enormous power cuts, and that in Harare, where she lives, the power comes on for a few hours in the middle of the night. They're getting up to cook or do ironing or something at 1 a.m. in the morning or something. And the local currency, they brought back the local currency, which had devalued to, I have a note from Zimbabwe from 2008 that is a $100 trillion note. So the devaluation was more, was incredulous. And so your family is sort of talking about some tough times there right now.
Do you go back ever?
We've been back a couple of times, and it's always lovely. You know, your place you're born and brought up in has a permanent pull for you, no matter where in the world you transplant yourself again, right? And so, and of course with family there, you still have ties.
And so you've lived in Canada now for so long. What has changed since when you first came here?
In Canada? I think there's a much greater awareness of the contribution of newcomers to this place. I currently work with a program called Settlement Workers in Schools. I was doing that as part of my regular work, and now I do some of that in retirement.
Oh, is it like volunteer?
This is actually contractual work.
Oh, okay.
But it is settling newcomer families to Abbotsford, and which is generally a lot to do with school. The school district, so it's getting them into school and making sure that they settle in successfully. But it's also wider than that. It is how can Abbotsford be a truly inclusive place for newcomers. And so I'm often involved in other organizations and events planning to help bridge that gap. And through my own experience, at least have some idea of what new immigrants need when they come.
Right.
So I spend a large part of my time now doing that, and I thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah. And so going back a bit, when you first came to Canada, did you have any special places you would go to if you had time off, or would you go traveling anywhere?
I guess because my kids were young, we traveled. We've traveled quite a lot in BC. We love the country. We've explored a lot of it by car, and done beautiful ferry trips around the provinces, place as well, and driven up and down the province. And we have lots of company that come from overseas and everywhere, and we take them on road trips everywhere. Been to the Rockies more times than probably local people have been. With a trip coming up next month with visitors who are coming who were friends from back home in Zambia. So
to the Rockies.
To the Rockies.
Oh, okay. It's beautiful up there.
It's beautiful. Yeah, BC is beautiful. We definitely live in one of the most beautiful places in the world.
For sure. And do you have any sort of hobbies or things you would do outside of work?
Yeah, I'm part of a book club, Good Reader. The same group of ladies have been going or reading together for 23 years, if you can believe it. Started as a group of teacher friends, and we're still 7, 8 of the original.
Wow! And you meet weekly?
We meet once a month or once in 6 weeks, and we read a new book. We discuss. So reading's a passion, hiking, traveling. And we love road trips. That's our favorite way to see any place. So wherever we can drive, we'll drive.
That's so awesome.
Like even we visited India as part of my retirement trip, and we started in Karnataka, and we did a road trip with friends in that province, and then we went up to to Gujarat, and we took a road trip through Rajasthan and up to the Taj Mahal and back. And so I think to me that's the way to see a country. And so road trips are really big.
And what was it like going to India, experiencing it?
Yeah, you know, going back to India, so my parents were from there, and I only visited once.
Oh, during that trip?
No, this was my second trip to India. Okay. And it was so interesting because I was surprised to find, because I grew up in Africa, I was born there, and then I live here, and I visited India once. But when I got there, it was the most strange thing that I experienced was a feeling of being at home. Oh, and I just can't explain it. We have no relatives left there. My parents had left, and we do have people back in the village that we visited, but very old now, and some long gone. But there was a real interesting pull for the place, which I found really surprising, but not so, I suppose. But I hadn't expected to feel that way when I went to India. That was one of the very unusual things I think that I experienced. But I mean, India obviously had changed in the time that I remember it from when I saw it through younger eyes. But vibrant, fascinating place. You can spend lots of time there, I guess. And,
for sure. And do you think like part of that feeling was from your childhood, how you guys were segregated into different groups?
I don't know if it was that. Other than that, it was just that we were Gujaratis, and I was back there in Gujarat with people who spoke the language, and where my parents were born, and there was just this feeling of, oh yeah, gosh, I think I belong here, which I found just strange because you've been to that place once in your life. Yeah. You could hardly call it home, but it's interesting. Yeah.
And then, did your parents ever come to Canada?
No, both my parents had died by the time we came to Canada. Or at least my father was alive, but not for many years after we came here, so they didn't see Canada.
And so what does a daily day in your life look like nowadays?
Well, nowadays, as I told you, I'm retired.
Right.
I spend a lot of time with family. I have 3 grandchildren.
Aww.
And a new little grandson about 4 months old now, so that's been very lovely. Yeah. And again, catching up with my friends, I read, I travel, we walk, hike, and I'm involved in a number of things that I enjoy doing, and love
could you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I work with part of my work with the settlement group also has me on a committee called the Abbotsford Local Immigration Partnership Council. And it's a council made up of several people in the city that have some vested interest for newcomers. So it might be employment, it might be housing, it might be city hall. And people will sit to talk about what newcomers need and how our community can respond better. So, I'm part of that organization, which and there's a subgroup that works on refugees in particular. So I work with a group, or belong to a team that works with that. Awesome. I'm very often at the Reach and, either, taking in the exhibits or attending what they have every Wednesday, which is a program called the 3 C's. Standing for coffee, cookies, and culture. And really what it is an hour-long either talk or film show or something on a topic of interest or someone. And they're very interesting, so I'm often there. And I really like theatre, so off to see plays or shows if I can in Vancouver. Awesome. Yeah, so that's what I'm busy doing mostly.
That's awesome. And when did you retire?
About 2.5 years ago.
Not too long ago. Wow. And I guess when you moved to Canada, did you ever have interactions with people, like First Nations people, or?
Through the people I worked with in the school district, and I learned so much. And what I love, so many of the philosophical things that I think our First Nations, Aboriginal people bring to us. The importance of family and oral traditions, the cultural things, and most of all for me was their respect for the earth and the environment. Like I feel is their greatest gift to us if we listen. About how important it is. And I remember my parents talking about Janma Bhoomi, or the land of your birth, or the motherland, and it had some, relevance at the time or whatever, but I didn't really thought about it as, Mother Earth and what it does for you kind of thing. And I feel the Aboriginal people really bring that out, and I've just, enjoyed all my associations with them, and I just learned so much through them, And I think they're just a wonderful, they have a lot to offer us,
For sure, definitely. And did you, during your time as a teacher, did you experience any difficulties within your career?
As in, you know what, I was pretty lucky. I think my husband may have felt that he didn't really get many jobs in the beginning because he didn't look a certain way.
Oh, okay.
I think he felt like they were polite. There were jobs being advertised, but suddenly they were filled when he showed up. Okay. So there was a little bit of that in the beginning. And I think when we came in '92, there was a bit of a recession happening. So it could have been a product of that, but I know he wondered whether it had something to do with the fact that he was who he was. So
what type of jobs was he?
And he was just looking for any basic job he could get, anything at all in the beginning, whatever was available in a shop or gas station or whatever. And even then it was, not as easy. But I said, it could have been other reasons, but he questioned that. Because all of a sudden always being told when he got there that the job had been filled, so there was some of that in the beginning.
And did he end up having a stable job?
Yeah, he changed a lot. He didn't really find, I guess, a niche that really worked for him, but he did what he could and then retired several years before me.
And what about your children? Did they go on to get
so
hired?
they've done well. They both attended university.
Okay. And what are their names?
But my daughter's name is Roshni.
Okay.
And she actually married very early, 22, wonderful man, and they have 2 children, and she stayed home to try and raise them, but also ran a jewelry business, which she has just closed, saying that it's provided all the creativity she needed. She's looking to do something else. And my son works in IT.
Okay.
In
And what
Vancouver.
is his name?
His name is Shamir.
Shamir. Okay.
Yeah, so they're the ones with the new little baby.
Okay. And do you have any other stories you'd like to tell me? Anything else that sticks out within your life?
Oh my gosh! I have so many stories, but I think for me it's just. At the end of the day, I guess, as a person who sort of lived in different countries and for one reason or another didn't really feel like that was 100% my country.
Right.
I've lived the longest now in Canada than I've lived anywhere else, and this is now home, And I think what I've learned about, being what I consider sort of a global citizen, if you will, is that, I wish we could get to a place where we're just seen for our common humanity, and I just feel like it's just sad to see the divisions we have around us when really we all are just the same and aspire to the same ideals, want the same for our families and our kids, and I just wish we could see more of a universal place.
And your experience is so unique. If you could give a message to the youth of today, what would you want to tell them?
I think that you can do anything that you put your mind to, and I always say, if you can't help something, at least do no harm. But I think we each can bring so much to a general view of community. I think our elders had it right. Like, we've moved a little bit away from that in terms of becoming pretty, individualistic, I would say, and I think that we lose something when we push ahead for ourselves, as it were. So, for youth, I really would like to say, yes, you have to have your personal goals and you have to get there, but it's so much more than that. You've got to encompass a lot more and give a lot more, right?
And just as a side note, as a woman, do you ever feel like you were disadvantaged in any way throughout?
For sure. I married, into an Indian family, and there were certain very, clear roles that I needed to play. And lucky for me, my mother-in-law was a very, very advanced thinker, and she was a real feminist in her day, and sort of thought, no, women need to do this and do that. And so she always, I had a driving license when I came, but I never thought I'd drive in Zambia because I didn't know the men drove in our family and so on. And it was my mother-in-law. My husband had got me a little car. He was working for Honda, and they'd given him a little tiny sports car. So I was even afraid to drive it in Zambia because the road conditions were not so great.
Right.
And my mother-in-law was the first one who pushed me. She's like, I'm like, the car doesn't even start. She said, I'll push and you drive. So I had a very good role model to navigate some of those sort of cultural, restrictions that someone like me would have had a problem with. So.
Right. So sweet.
Yeah.
So anything else?
I think I've had a very fortunate journey, and been lucky enough to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. Thanks a lot.